My husband stacked my boxes on the front porch in January. Not inside the front hall, not in the garage. On the porch, in -14, where the cardboard would go soft from the cold and the snow that had been falling since noon would work its way into every fold. I just finished a 12-hour shift at the hospital, still in my scrubs, my hospital badge swinging against my chest as I turned onto our street and saw them there. 6 boxes and 2 garbage bags, arranged in a neat row like he'd thought about it carefully. Like he'd wanted me to understand that this was not an accident. I didn't go to the door right away. I sat in my car at the end of the driveway for a moment, the engine running, the heater working hard against the cold, and I watched the living room window. My husband was standing in there with a woman from his office, the one he'd introduced me to at the company Christmas party in November. She'd hugged me when we met and said she'd heard so many wonderful things. She was wearing my gray cardigan, the chunky one my mother had knitted for me the winter before her diagnosis, the one with the wooden buttons I'd had to order online because you couldn't find them anywhere anymore. She was standing in my living room wearing my dead mother's cardigan and holding a glass of wine like she lived there. I turned off the engine and got out of the car. The front door code had been changed. The garage had been rekeyed. I pressed the doorbell and heard it ring inside. Neither of them moved toward the door. I pressed it again. My husband finally came to the door and opened it maybe 8 inches, his body filling the gap. He said he thought this would be easier than a conversation. He said it wasn't working and we both knew it and there was no point dragging things out. He said I should take my things and figure out my next steps and that he'd be in touch about the paperwork. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about 12 years. I thought about driving him to emergency the winter he had appendicitis. About painting every room in the house together the summer we moved in. About sitting beside my mother's hospital bed and calling him and hearing him say he was stuck at the office and couldn't make it. About all the nights I'd worked overnight at the hospital and come home in the morning to a cold coffee maker and a note that said he'd gone in early. I didn't say any of that. I said, okay. I walked back to my car, opened the glove compartment, and took out my phone. I scrolled to a number I'd saved 4 months ago under the name of my mother's estate lawyer. A name I'd held on to since the day her assistant had called me after everything settled and said there were some things I needed to understand about the property. Things that hadn't come up at the funeral because there hadn't been time, and things that my mother had specifically asked to be handled quietly. I pressed call. The woman who answered had a calm, deliberate voice that sounded like someone who had delivered difficult news for a long time and had stopped being rattled by any of it. I told her the locks had been changed. I told her my husband had put my belongings on the porch. She said she'd be there in 40 minutes and that I should wait in my car and not engage further. I climbed back into the driver's seat. The woman across the street, who had lived there since before I moved in and who used to bring my mother soup when she was having bad weeks, came out of her front door with a travel mug and a folding chair. She didn't say a word. She just set the chair next to my passenger door and stood beside it in her parka with her arms crossed, looking at my front porch like she was standing guard. Her husband appeared in their doorway a minute later with his phone out. He'd been recording since before I'd rung the bell. I found that out later. The lawyer arrived in 38 minutes in a dark green Subaru that looked like it had made this kind of trip before. She was in her late 50s with short gray hair and a canvas tote bag full of folders, and she walked up my front path like she owned it, which in a legal sense she was about to make very clear that she represented someone who did. She rang the bell. My husband opened the door. She introduced herself as Carol Whitfield, partner at a firm in the city, acting on behalf of the estate of my mother and in the interests of her sole heir. My husband said he didn't understand what that had to do with anything. Carol said it had to do with quite a lot, actually, and she'd appreciate a few minutes of his time. She handed him an envelope. He took it because people generally take things when they're handed to them with enough confidence. He opened it. I watched from the car as he read the first page. I watched his posture change. The straightness went out of his shoulders first, then his jaw loosened, and he looked up from the paper and over at me in my car with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. I got out of the car and walked up to them. Carol explained it simply. The house had been purchased in my mother's name in 1991, before I was married, before I was even engaged. When my father passed, it remained solely in her name. When my husband and I moved in 8 years ago and he began referring to it as our house, he was technically correct in the sense that he lived there. He was not correct in any legal sense. His name had never appeared on the title. My mother had permitted us to live there, had genuinely wanted us to have a stable home, but she had never transferred ownership to either of us jointly. When she died 14 months ago, the house transferred to me alone through a registered deed that had been filed at the land registry office in the city 3 years before her death. My name. Only mine. My husband said that was impossible. He said he'd made mortgage payments. Carol said there was no mortgage, that the house had been owned outright since 2003, and that any money he believed he'd been contributing to housing costs had been rent, effectively, paid to a homeowner who had never charged him for it. He said my mother would have told him. Carol said my mother had chosen not to, and that given what she had learned about his activities during the final year of her life, her silence had been both deliberate and warranted. The woman from his office had appeared in the hallway behind him by now. Still in my cardigan, her expression had shifted from the comfortable confidence she'd had at the window to something more careful, more watchful. Carol reached into her tote and pulled out a second folder. She said there was something else. Over the previous 2 years, someone had attempted to access the equity in this property twice. Once through a home equity line of credit application at a major bank, and once through a refinancing inquiry at another lender. Both applications had included documentation that listed my husband as a co-owner of the property. Both had included what appeared to be my signature on the consent forms. My mother had been contacted by the second lender as part of a routine title search because the property was still partially in her name at the time through the estate process. That was how she found out. My husband's hand had stopped moving. He was holding the folder the way you hold something when you've forgotten you're holding it. Carol said the 2 applications had resulted in approximately $89,000 in credit being advanced. The lenders had already been notified. Given that the property had never been his to use as collateral, and given that the signatures on the consent documents were forged, he would be personally liable for repayment. She said the word forged the way you say a word when you want it to land, and it landed. I had not known about the money. I knew about the affair, or suspected it. I had found enough in the previous months to make suspicion feel nearly certain. But I had not known he had been using my mother's house, my house, to borrow money he hadn't told me about. $89,000. I thought about the years she'd spent paying that house off slowly, the way she'd talked about it being the one thing she could leave me that was real. That would last. That no one could take. He started to explain. He said the business had gone through a difficult period. He said he'd intended to pay it back before I noticed. He said he'd been handling it. Carol said handling it by forging your spouse's signature on financial documents is not a legal strategy, and suggested he speak to a lawyer of his own before saying anything further. The woman in the hallway had taken a step back. She was calculating. I could see it happening in real time. The way her eyes moved between my husband and Carol and the folder, the way she was quietly measuring the distance between where she was standing and the door. Carol reached into the tote one more time. She said there was one more thing. My mother had hired a private investigator 8 months before she died. She had begun to suspect that something was wrong, both with my husband's fidelity and with some financial discrepancies she'd noticed in documents she'd seen during her illness. The investigator had confirmed the affair within 6 weeks. Had documented meetings, locations, dates, had noted that several of those meetings had taken place on evenings when my mother had been in hospital and I had been there with her, and my husband had said he was working. He had not been working. Carol placed a photograph on the top of the stack, face up. My husband looked at it. The woman in the hallway looked at it. Neither of them said anything. My mother had known for 8 months. She'd held that knowledge alongside everything else she was carrying, the treatments and the exhaustion and the end of her life coming toward her like a slow tide, and she'd used whatever energy she had left not to collapse under it but to protect me from it. She'd arranged the deed transfer. She'd kept her own counsel about what she knew. She'd sat across from me at the kitchen table during her good weeks and listened to me talk about my marriage like it was something I still believed in, and she'd nodded and poured more tea and kept her face completely even. I had to sit down. The neighbor across the street brought the folding chair up the walk without being asked. My husband had nothing left to say. The woman he'd brought into our home had retreated further into the hallway. Carol told him he had 72 hours to remove his personal belongings and vacate the property. A copy of the restraining order, effective immediately, prohibited him from disposing of or damaging anything inside the house beyond his own clothing and personal effects. She said the word vacate with a kind of professional precision that made it sound final because it was. He looked at me then. Really looked at me, maybe for the first time in a long time. He said he hadn't thought I knew. I told him I'd found out 4 months ago, when Carol's office had first reached out. I told him I'd had 4 months to understand exactly what he had done and decide what I was going to do about it. He said I'd let him go on not knowing that I knew. I said yes. I said my mother had taught me the value of patience. He went inside. The door was still open and I could hear him moving through the rooms, the particular sound of drawers being opened and closed that means a life coming apart. Carol stood beside me on the porch. She reached into the tote one last time and took out a cream envelope with my name on it in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere, even now, more than a year after the last time I'd seen it. My mother's careful cursive, slightly shakier than it used to be but still unmistakably hers. Carol said she'd been asked to deliver it today specifically. That my mother had anticipated this scenario with enough confidence that she'd set up a protocol with the law office. The moment any changes were filed regarding the property without my explicit authorization, Carol was to be notified and was to reach out to me immediately. My mother had known her son-in-law well enough to be certain the day would come. I held the envelope in both hands. I asked Carol if I could go inside to read it. She said it was my house. I could do whatever I liked in it. I walked up the porch steps past my own boxes. The woman from his office was in the front hall, still wearing my cardigan. She looked at me and I looked at her and I held out my hand, palm up, and waited. She took the cardigan off without a word and gave it to me. I folded it over my arm and walked past her into my mother's house. The kitchen still smelled the way it always had. Roasted coffee and dish soap and the particular warmth of a house that has been lived in long enough to have a smell. I sat at the table, the same round oak table that had been there since before I was born, and I opened the envelope. The letter was 4 pages. Her handwriting. She began by saying she hoped she was wrong. She said she'd spent the last year of her life hoping very sincerely that her instincts about my husband were mistaken, that the investigators' reports were somehow exaggerated, that the financial documents she'd found were the result of some confusion she hadn't fully understood. She said she'd hoped hard enough that hoping had started to feel like its own kind of work. She hadn't been wrong. She wrote that the house had always been hers alone. That when I married, she had thought briefly about transferring it jointly, the way people do, the way it seemed like the obvious and generous thing to do. But something had stopped her. She wrote that she'd called it instinct at the time and dismissed it as overprotection, the kind of thing a mother does when she doesn't want to let go. She knew now it had been something more accurate than that. She wrote that she had transferred the title into my name through a registered deed 3 years before she died. Not through the will, which could be contested, but through a proper transfer, recorded at the registry office, irrevocable. She had done it quietly, without telling anyone, and she had made sure that my husband's name appeared nowhere in the documentation. She wrote about the money. She said she'd been shown the forged documents by the lender's title search team and had understood immediately what they meant. She said that learning he had forged my name had been the moment her grief about the situation turned into resolve. She wrote, "I was not going to leave this world and leave you unprotected from someone who had already decided you were a resource." She had spent her final months doing what she could. Organizing, documenting, setting up the trigger with Carol's office so that nothing could happen to the property without my knowing. She wrote that she wished she could have just rested, that she wished she could have spent those months simply being my mother without the work of dismantling everything he'd tried to build on top of something that was never his. She wrote that she was proud of me in a way she'd never quite found the right words for. She said I had her stubbornness and her grandmother's patience and my father's specific way of going very still in a crisis, which she had always found remarkable. She said she had watched me work double shifts at the hospital to cover the cost of her treatment and come home tired enough to barely speak and still ask how her day had been. She said I had given her everything a daughter could give. She said my husband had given her his absence when it mattered most. Inside the envelope, folded separately, was a check. $35,000 made out to me, drawn on an account I didn't recognize, dated 10 days before she died. She explained it in the letter. A portion of her RRSP, drawn down deliberately, taxes already set aside, money she had been holding in reserve for years and had decided to move into my hands directly rather than let it pass through the estate where it might be subject to dispute. She wrote, "Use it for whatever you need. Pay off what he put in debt. Take time. Or keep it until you know what you want to build." She wrote, "I have a feeling you'll build something." The tears came there. Not slowly but all at once, the way they do when you've been holding something back for a long time and you finally put it down. I cried at the kitchen table with her letter in my hands, and outside I could hear my husband loading his things into his car. And I let myself feel all of it. The grief and the fury and the relief, and underneath all of it the extraordinary, almost unbearable weight of being loved that completely by someone who was gone. I heard Carol come in. She stood in the kitchen doorway and waited until I looked up. She said there was something I needed to know about the woman my husband had brought here. Something that had come to light during the background search my mother had commissioned. I asked her what could possibly be left. Carol said the woman my husband believed he was starting a life with had a common law partner. Had been in a common law relationship for 9 years in another province. They had a joint mortgage on a property outside of Halifax. She had left 4 months ago, around the same time she'd become involved with my husband, and her partner had been trying to locate her since then. He'd been in contact with a lawyer of his own about the financial irregularities she'd left behind. She had cleaned out their joint account before she left. Roughly $22,000. I stared at Carol. Carol said the woman had done something like this before. 7 years ago, in Alberta. Targeted a man in the middle of a separation. Established herself in his home. And then made a claim based on cohabitation. Common law rights in Canada are complicated and vary by province. She knew which provinces had stronger protections for common law partners, and she knew how to use them. She had not, as far as the investigator could determine, ever succeeded in actually extracting significant assets, but she had never stopped trying. She had targeted my husband the way you target something you've assessed and found useful. I thought about him standing at that door, so certain. The boxes on the porch. The changed garage code. He had believed he was in control of this situation from beginning to end. Carol said the woman's common law partner had driven from Halifax when Carol's investigator had found him and explained where she was. He'd arrived in the city that morning. He was parked down the street. He had a folder of his own. I said let him come. I said I wanted to be in the backyard when it happened, but that he was welcome to come onto the property and do whatever he needed to do. I went outside through the back door and stood in the yard in my coat. The garden had been neglected for over a year, since before my mother got too sick to tend it herself, and it looked it. Dead stalks from last summer still standing in the beds, the whole thing frozen and gray. But I could see the structure underneath, the bones of what she'd planted. The roses she'd put in along the back fence 20 years ago were still there. They always came back. I could hear voices from the front yard. I heard my husband's voice, and then a stranger's voice, and then, after a moment, the particular sound of silence that follows something that cannot be taken back. Carol came around the side of the house. She said it was going as expected. She said the woman had tried 2 or 3 versions of a story before abandoning them. She said my husband was having what she described as a difficult few minutes. I said that seemed about right. She stayed with me in the yard for a while. She told me about my mother during the last year. How she'd come into the office every few weeks to check on the documentation, sometimes with a home care worker, sometimes on her own if she was having a good day. How she'd been methodical and clear-headed right up until very near the end. How she'd known exactly what she wanted and had made sure it would happen regardless of whether she was there to oversee it. Carol said, she talked about you every time she came in. Every single time. The neighbor from across the street came around the corner of the house with 2 cups of Tim Hortons coffee. She handed one to me and one to Carol without saying a word. Then she stood there with us, the 3 of us in the frozen backyard, while the light started to fade. Eventually, the sound from the front yard settled into something quieter and then stopped. Carol went around front to see to things. The neighbor stayed with me. She told me she'd known my mother for 23 years. She said my mother had shown up at her door the week she moved in with a casserole and an offer to help with the garden whenever she needed it. She said they'd drunk coffee together in this backyard more times than she could count. She said my mother had talked to her about the property. Had mentioned, without going into detail, that she'd taken steps to make sure I'd be protected. I asked why she hadn't told me. She said she'd been asked not to. She said those had been the terms. I laughed a little at that, because that was the most my mother thing I'd ever heard. My husband was gone by the time I came back around front. He'd taken his bags without ceremony. The woman had left separately, her common law partner behind her, presumably with the papers that needed signing. Carol said he'd gotten what he came for in terms of documentation and that the rest would have to work itself out through other channels. The neighbor's husband came over with his phone and showed me the footage. Everything from the moment I'd first turned up the street. He said his daughter had contacts at the city's fraud unit and that if I wanted to pursue the forged documents, the footage would be useful as part of a broader evidence package. I said yes. I said more than okay. Carol left me with a folder of my own. Everything in it, the title deed, the trust documentation, the evidence the investigator had compiled, the records of the fraudulent loan applications, referrals to a family lawyer she trusted and a financial advisor who specialized in helping people restructure after situations like this. She said my mother had thought of everything. I stood in my front hall after everyone had gone. The house was quiet in the way that houses get when something has just ended. It would need cleaning. There were shoes by the door that weren't mine and a jacket on the hook I'd never seen before and a wine glass on the coffee table that she'd left when she'd taken off her coat to hand it back to me. I'd deal with all of it. But not tonight. I went upstairs with my mother's letter and I read it again, sitting on my bed, in the room where I'd slept as a child and where I'd slept for the last 8 years of my marriage and where I would now sleep alone, and I felt something change in the quality of the air. Not disappear but shift. Like a window being opened. She'd ended the letter with something that took me a minute to understand. She'd written that the house knew who had stayed and who had left. That houses remember. In their way. She'd written that 4 generations of women in our family had lived in this house and that not one of them had ever stopped fighting for the people they loved. She said she expected I wouldn't either. She was right. I took 3 weeks off work. The first week I slept, which I needed, and went through the house systematically and took everything that was hers and handled it the way she would have wanted. The second week I called the financial advisor Carol had referred me to and began to understand what my actual situation looked like, which was better than I'd feared and clearer than it had been in years. The third week I called a woman I worked with who I knew was in the middle of a divorce, whose husband had taken the car and the TFSA and left her with a lease she couldn't cover on her own, and I said I had something I wanted to talk to her about. We met at the kitchen table. My kitchen table. Hers before mine. By the time spring came, there were 8 of us meeting every second Thursday evening. Women from the hospital. Women from the neighborhood. Friends of friends who'd heard through the particular network that forms when women start talking honestly to each other about money and property and the things that happen when a marriage ends and you realize you don't know half of what you should have known about your own financial situation. We talked about practical things first because that was what people needed most. Credit rebuilding. Understanding property rights in the province. Knowing the difference between common law and married in terms of what you were actually entitled to. Knowing your own name on your own accounts. We had a paralegal come once a month to answer questions on a volunteer basis. And a financial planner who donated 2 hours to the group every quarter. But we also talked about the other things. The shame of it. The specific shame that comes from realizing you trusted someone who had decided you were an obstacle. The way you go back through years of memories and re-examine them with new information. The exhaustion of having to rebuild not just your finances but your sense of what is real. We talked about that too, every meeting, because it needed to be talked about and so few places actually made room for it. I used part of the $35,000 to retain a family lawyer through the divorce. My husband didn't contest much. He was occupied with the fraud charges that had begun to work their way through the system, and with the debt from the loans that now sat entirely in his name. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that he'd moved into a 1-bedroom apartment on the other side of the city and was working weekends to cover his obligations. I didn't feel sorry for him. I didn't feel the rage I'd expected either. Mostly I felt a kind of clarity, like the moment after a storm when everything smells different. The woman he'd brought into the house disappeared, the way people like her do. Her common-law partner got the paperwork sorted and returned to Halifax with his accounts partially restored. I thought about the house there. The joint mortgage, the way something that's supposed to be shared can be used against the person who trusted you to share it fairly. I sent him a brief message through the lawyer months later, just to say I hoped things were settling. He wrote back 2 sentences, said they were managing. Said he hoped I was doing the same. First winter after the divorce I hosted Christmas. 11 people in the house, which had never had 11 people in it for Christmas before. The neighbor from across the street and her husband, 3 women from the Thursday group and their kids. My colleague from the hospital who'd become a genuine friend over the previous months. A man I'd met at a community event in October, quiet and careful, who taught at a secondary school and had lost his wife to cancer 2 years earlier and who understood without needing it explained what it meant to be rebuilt slowly and with some caution. He brought butter tarts from a bakery near his apartment and stayed until 10, and when he left he squeezed my hand at the door. The kids ran through the rooms and my mother's books got handled and put back in different places, and someone's child discovered the piano in the front room that no one had played in years and picked out the opening bars of Klaus. Something recognizable with one finger until her mother gently redirected her. The house held all of it. The noise and the cold coming in whenever the door opened and the smell of food and the specific warmth of a room full of people who'd chosen to be there. My mother would have stood at the kitchen counter and watched it all with that expression she had when she was trying not to cry at something beautiful. Late that night when everyone had gone, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and her letter, which I kept in the drawer now instead of upstairs, and I read the end of it one more time. The part where she'd written that she had faith I would build something from this. The part where she'd said the house remembered loyalty. I looked at the rooms around me. The garden outside the window, which I'd started working on in the fall and which would be something again by summer. The chairs around the table, more of them now than there used to be. The shelf of her books, the wooden buttons on the cardigan hanging on the hook by the back door. She had been right. About all of it. About him, about the house, about me. She had made her choices in the last months of her life with complete clarity and without self-pity. And she had left me something that could not be taken because she had made sure it could not be taken. I wasn't just her daughter, I was also what she'd built. And now I was building too. The house knew. The house remembered. And so did I. If this story stayed with you, hit the like button and let me know in the comments which moment hit you hardest. For me, it's still the cardigan. Don't go anywhere, there's more coming.